From the rise of a distant hill, the human capital revealed itself at last. Massive stone walls encircled the city like a clenched fist, watchtowers rising at regular intervals with banners snapping in the morning wind. Within the walls, dense rooftops crowded together, smoke curling from chimneys as roads converged toward the main gate. The city pulsed with movement and order, but beneath it lay control, measured and absolute. At the capital gate, the trio was halted immediately. Heavily armed guards formed a solid line, armor polished and weapons ready. Spears angled toward Grog without hesitation, his orc frame drawing open hostility. War had sharpened suspicion, and in times like these, race alone was enough to be judged guilty. Ilara stepped forward and presented the elven envoy letter. Beside her, Kaito displayed the emblem granted by the monks. The guards barely glanced at either before scoffing. One extended a hand slowly, palm up, fingers rubbing together in a silent demand for coin. Dust swirled at their feet as smirk spread, corruption practiced openly, without shame. The border guard captain arrived with deliberate swagger. He studied the trio, then leaned closer toward Ilara, his grin crude and lingering. With a dismissive wave, he ignored Grog entirely and spoke plainly. Passage could be arranged, he said, if the elf were left behind at the gate. Kaito's hand clenched tight, knuckles whitening as anger threatened to break free. Before the moment could fracture further, a hooded man stepped in close to the captain. He whispered something low and urgent, slipping a sealed letter into his hand. The captain's grin vanished. Color drained from his face as his eyes scanned the seal. Arrogance gave way to fear in a single breath. Moments later, the captain approached again, this time bowing stiffly. His voice trembled as he apologized, returning the documents and issuing official identity cards. He ordered the gate opened at once. Guards exchanged confused glances as the massive doors creaked apart, forced politeness barely masking the tension that lingered in the air. Elsewhere, far from the gate, Ren sat alone at his desk in a dim chamber. A single candle burned between scattered maps and sealed letters, its flame steady. He looked forward calmly and spoke into the quiet, welcoming them to his territory. Beside him, a second figure stood in shadow, face completely obscured, listening, unmoving, and unseen. The trio moved through the capital by way of narrow side streets, keeping to the shadows where the city pressed in close. Grog wore a long dark hood that concealed his green skin and tusks, his massive frame forced into careful stillness as they avoided the main roads. Light barely reached the stone between cramped buildings, and every step felt measured, like the city itself was watching. From adjoining avenues came the sound of boots and steel. Heavy patrols of armored soldiers marched in tight formation, forcing civilians to the edges of the road. Weapons were carried openly, hands never far from hilts. The guards did not look at the people they displaced, only through them. At a collection point, a soldier shoved a trembling man who hesitated as he handed over his tax. Coins spilled across the ground, scattering like broken promises. Fear flickered through the gathered crowd, mixed with resentment that dared not rise to anger. Not here, not now. Above it all, on a raised street, richly decorated carriages rolled past. Nobles lounged within, bodies heavy with excess, draped in silk and gold that caught the sun. Guards cleared their path without hesitation, shouting commoners aside. Wealth moved easily here, untouched by the war it helped prolong. Ilara watched the procession in silence. Her gaze lingered not on the nobles, but on the hungry children clutching their parents as the carriages passed. The contrast settled heavily in her chest, a quiet reminder of who paid the price for protection they would never see. Walls throughout the district were plastered with notices. War proclamations and tax decrees nailed one over another. Emergency levies were declared in the name of demon defense, their words fluttering in the wind. Crowds gathered beneath them in uneasy silence, reading the same demands again and again, as if hoping they might change. Kaito paused briefly in the mouth of a shadowed alley, glancing back at the streets they had left behind. Grog stood close, tense but controlled, ready to move if needed. Ilara remained alert, her eyes scanning faces and exits alike. The city breathed around them, restless, fearful, and far closer to breaking than its walls would ever admit. As they moved through the crowded street, Kaito slowed his pace just slightly. It wasn't fear that caught him, it was instinct. The pressure of a gaze settled on him alone, persistent and deliberate. He scanned reflections in windows and the movement of passing bodies, but found nothing. Whoever was watching knew how not to be seen. Without turning his head, Kaito lifted one hand and made a series of quick, precise signals. Grog and Alara caught them instantly. Without any questions or hesitation, the rhythm of their steps changed in unison. Ahead, Grog and Alara turned sharply into a narrow alley on the left, vanishing into shadow. Kaito continued forward alone, his pace measured, unhurried, bait offered carefully. The city seemed to close in as the light thinned around him. At the mouth of the alley, Kaito stopped and turned in one smooth motion. At the same instant, Grog and Alara stepped out behind the target, sealing the path. The move was clean, practiced, complete. The figure following them found himself boxed in, escape routes cut off from both directions. The hooded man did not reach for a weapon. He laughed instead, low and amused, lifting his head just enough for half his face to catch the light. He praised their coordination, their timing, the discipline of their silence. Then he introduced himself calmly as Spymaster Kale, the one who oversaw the eyes and ears of the kingdom. If they wanted the truth they were circling, he said, they should meet him the next afternoon, by the ruins near the forest, east of the city. Before anyone could respond, Kale stepped back and launched upward in a single, fluid motion. His cloak flared once as he cleared the alley wall, landing on the rooftop above. Another step, and he was gone, swallowed by height and shadow. The trio stood frozen, staring upward in silence, stunned by an agility that no ordinary man should possess. The ruins waited at the forest's edge, half swallowed by vines and time. Broken pillars leaned where walls once stood, stone cracked and softened by years of neglect. Afternoon light filtered through the trees as Alara, Kaito, and Grog approached with caution, every step echoing louder than it should have in the quiet. He was already there. Standing atop a collapsed stone slab, Kale watched them arrive as if they were late to an appointment. His posture was relaxed, his cloak still, forest shadows framing him like a curtain already drawn back. There was no warning. In a blink, Kale vanished, and reappeared directly in front of Kaito. A sharp sting flashed across Kaito's thumb as a thin needle struck true. Before breath could catch, Kale was already moving away, the moment torn open by speed too fast to follow. Kale stood once more where he had been, as if he had never moved at all. In his hand rested a small crystal sphere, now glowing faintly. Kaito stared at his bleeding thumb in disbelief. Grog tensed, muscles coiling, while Alara stepped forward instinctively, too late to stop what had already been done. The glow intensified. Light bloomed inside the crystal, bright and unmistakable. Kale's eyes reflected it as he smiled slightly, satisfied. He spoke calmly then, explaining that the crystal responded only to the blood of royal lineage. The light was proof. Their suspicion had been correct. Silence crashed down on the ruins. Kaito stood frozen, the words refusing to settle into meaning. Ilara's breath caught, shock widening her eyes. Grog shifted into a protective stance without thinking. Across from them, Kale remained composed, the glowing crystal steady in his palm as he named the truth aloud. Kaito was the lost prince. Kale's voice lowered as the past took shape. Years ago, a royal caravan traveled along the forest road near the elven borders, banners flying openly in the daylight. The journey was ceremonial, meant to seek the blessing of the forest spirit for the youngest prince. The escort was strong, the mood confident. No one expected betrayal to ride with them. Inside the main carriage sat the royal family. The crown prince, only 16, wore light armor and watched the road with forced maturity, tasked with overseeing the caravan security. The queen sat composed beside him, the young princess close at her side. In the maid's arms rested a quiet toddler, Prince Kaito, unaware that this journey would erase his name from history. The attack came without warning. Mercenaries poured from the forest in coordinated waves. Arrows darkened the sky. Explosions tore through the escort as smoke and fire swallowed the road. What should have been impossible unfolded in moments. Precision, planning, and overwhelming force. The crown prince fought fiercely, rallying guards and cutting down attackers with desperate resolve. But training and courage were not enough. Mercenaries pressed in from all sides, numbers and preparation turning bravery into inevitability. One by one, the defenders fell. When the chaos ended, The road was unrecognizable. Carriages burned where they had fallen. Bodies lay scattered amid ash and broken banners. The queen and the crown prince lay motionless among the dead. By dawn, the royal line appeared extinguished. Near the edge of the elven forest, investigators later found the maid's injured body hidden among the leaves. She had died shielding something, or someone. But the child she carried was gone. There was no blood, no tracks, no remains, only absence. And that absence, Cale said quietly, was where the truth had been buried. Back in the ruins, Cale continued without urgency. He explained that at the time of the royal massacre, he had been nothing more than a subordinate, serving under the then spymaster. When the caravan was destroyed, Ren demanded a death sentence of then spymaster for failure. The king intervened instead. The spymaster was stripped of his post and forced to step down, quietly disgraced. Cale's eyes hardened as he spoke. From that moment on, suspicion took root. Too many reports pointed the same way. Ren had been meeting the merchant guild frequently before the incident. The merchants were furious, because the king had moved against their corruption and illegal trade. But suspicion was not proof. And without proof, Ren remained untouchable. Cale remembered standing behind his former master in the intelligence chamber, candlelight barely holding back the shadows. Ren stood opposite them, calm and immaculate, applying pressure without raising his voice. The room felt smaller with him in it. That was when Cale understood. Power did not need to shout. The former spymaster removed his insignia and pressed it into King's hand. Later he secretly gave me last order. The order was simple and dangerous. Pretend loyalty to Ren. Stay close. Watch everything. Track the missing prince if he lived. Cale accepted without hesitation. From that day forward, every step he took was part of a longer deception. Cale's story carried them forward in time, to Ren's office. The trio stood before the minister's desk, sunlight framing the city skyline behind him. Ren looked composed, almost welcoming, as if receiving guests rather than adversaries. Ren leaned forward, fingers interlaced, his voice low and even. He spoke frankly. Kaito resembled the ill king too closely to be ignored. If the trio agreed to serve him, to act as his shadow and leverage, he could offer them protection and resources. If not, he would eliminate them quietly, as the merchant guild demanded. When the trio refused, he gave them 3 days to decide. Ren turned away then, facing a wall map marked with trade routes and borders. His back to them was deliberate. The ultimatum hung in the air without needing repetition. Power, he implied, did not negotiate twice. The trio left the government district in silence. Guards and officials passed them without interest, unaware of how close the city had come to losing its future, or how deeply compromised it already was. In a quiet side street away from prying eyes, Cale waited for them. He spoke carefully now, urgency replacing composure. He promised to arrange an audience with a loyal general, one of the few still unbought. Through him, they could reach the king himself, who lay gravely ill. If we move quickly, Cale said, we may still reach his majesty before Ren finishes what he started. As evening settled, a messenger pigeon touched down on a stone balcony, wings fluttering once before going still. A sealed letter hung from its leg, small, unassuming, and urgent. Messages like this were never sent lightly. When they flew, lives were already in motion. In a private chamber, General Darius broke the seal and read. The color drained from his face as the words took shape. His grip tightened around the parchment, knuckles whitening. He sent his loyal men to inform the situation to King. Within the royal infirmary, King Aldrich was helped from his bed. His body was frail, movement slow, but his eyes remained sharp with awareness. Servants steadied him while physicians murmured warnings. Ministers hovered close, their concern equal parts fear and calculation. The procession moved through the long corridors toward the crown room. The king leaned heavily on those beside him, each step deliberate. Footsteps echoed off stone as guards fell into formation. The palace seemed to hold its breath, sensing that something long delayed was finally being forced into the open. Torches flared as the crown room filled. Banners hung motionless above the gathered court. At a distance stood Kaito, Grog, and Alara, drawn into the heart of power. Beside them waited Cale, silent and watchful, as the king was guided toward the throne. From the edge of the chamber, Kale observed every movement. He noted who arrived quickly, who hesitated, and who avoided meeting the king's gaze. This was the moment he had prepared for, when truths could surface. Elsewhere, in a dimly lit office, a shadowed guard knelt beside Ren's desk and whispered the news. Ren listened without interruption, candlelight tracing half his face while the rest remained in darkness. He showed no reaction, but the silence stretched just long enough to betray that the board had shifted. Before the assembled court, Kale spoke plainly. He described the test, the needle, the blood, and the crystal that had answered only to royal lineage. The weight of its reaction filled the room. Murmurs rippled through the gathered nobles and ministers as all eyes slowly turned toward Kaito. Faces studied him closely now. Ministers leaned forward. Nobles exchanged glances. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. The same line of the jaw, the same eyes that mirrored a younger version of the man on the throne. Shock mingled with disbelief, suspicion with dawning realization. Upon the throne, King Aldrich sat upright, hands resting calmly on the armrests. His face revealed nothing. No anger, no hope, no grief. If recognition stirred within him, it did not surface. The silence of his expression unsettled the room more than any outcry could have. The crown room fell into a strained stillness. Ilara's breath caught as she watched Kaito from across the chamber. Grog stood rigid beside him, a quiet wall of muscle and resolve. Kale remained composed, already reading the currents shifting beneath the floor. Truth had been spoken, but it had not yet been accepted. The moment shattered. The great doors burst open as Ren stormed in, voice raised, flanked by heavily armed soldiers. Steel rang against stone as weapons came up. Ren shouted orders, demanding the king's protection from what he called a fraud, an assassin masquerading as royalty. Ren's finger stabbed toward Kaito as guards spread out, tightening the circle around the trio. Accusations spilled freely, claims of deception, of assassination plots, of betrayal. All eyes snapped back to Kaito, waiting for denial, for outrage, for defense. Kaito did none of it. He stood still, head lowered, jaw clenched tight. He did not deny being an assassin. He did not raise his voice. The silence was deliberate and devastating. Behind him, soldiers closed ranks, tension pressing in from every side as the weight of his past collided with the truth of his blood. The moment shattered without warning. Ilara moved first, faster than thought, faster than fear. She crossed the distance between herself and King Aldrich in a blur as an arrow screamed through the air toward the throne. Her body turned, her staff never rose. She chose herself as the shield. The impact threw her to her knees. Blood spread quickly across the white of her robes where the arrow struck. The king recoiled in shock as the court erupted. Grog stepped forward like a wall, weapon raised, while General Darius drew steel and barked orders. Ren's soldiers surged, and were met head-on. Kaito snapped back into the world. He was moving before he realized it, catching Ilara as she sagged forward. Panic broke through his control as he held her, blood warm against his hands. For the first time since entering the crown room, his composure was gone, replaced by fear he could not hide. On the throne, the king's strength failed him. He clutched his chest, breath hitching, but forced himself upright. With a trembling hand, he pointed toward Kaito. His voice cut through the chaos, thin, final, undeniable. He named Kaito as his heir. Then the strength left him, and he collapsed. Battle lines formed inside the crown room. Loyal guards and General Darius's forces locked shields against Ren's advancing Illid army, steel clashing against stone. Servants and physicians rushed the king through a side passage as shouts echoed and banners trembled overhead. The crown room had become a battlefield. In the retreating corridors, Kale led them hard and fast. Kaito carried Ilara in his arms, refusing to let go, while Grog guarded the rear, every step daring pursuit. Torchlight streaked past as they vanished into the palace depths. Truth declared, blood spilled, and a kingdom forever changed. The moment the king was taken away, the court fractured. On one side stood the loyalists, nobles who still believed in the crown as an institution rather than a convenience. They gathered beneath the royal banner, faces drawn but resolute, accepting the king's final decree Kaito as the next heir. For them, legitimacy mattered more than safety, and tradition still carried weight. Opposite them in shadowed halls formed another block, quieter but far more dangerous. These nobles aligned themselves with Ren, men and women whose wealth had grown alongside corruption and illegal trade. They did not speak of the king's will, only of control, damage, and opportunity. Between these two groups lingered a third. The undecided. They kept their distance in dim corridors and private chambers, watching carefully, choosing silence over loyalty. Their expressions revealed calculation rather than conviction. They would not act until the outcome was clear, and whichever side emerged victorious, they would claim they had always stood there. Deep within the palace infirmary, King Aldrich lay unconscious upon a broad bed of carved oak. Physicians worked in hushed urgency, murmuring over mixtures and pulse checks while lamps flickered low. Guards stood rigid at every entrance. The room felt less like a place of healing and more like a vigil, life suspended by fragile threads. Far from the palace, hidden beneath stone and secrecy, Ilara lay wounded upon a narrow bed. Monks and healers surrounded her, channeling soft green-gold magic into torn flesh and shattered strength. The glow pulsed gently, steady but strained. Every moment mattered. If she fell, more than one realm would feel it. Above ground, the capital burned. Barricades collapsed into flame, streets choked with smoke and fleeing civilians. Towers scarred by fire loomed over shattered marketplaces. War had arrived not at the gates, but inside the heart of the city. At the front lines, Grog fought beside General Darius. Grog stood immovable, blocking charges that would have broken lesser lines, his strikes precise and controlled. Around him, stone cracked and bodies fell as the clash surged through the streets. The Loyalists' army and rebels groups united against the forces of Ren. Former divisions vanished under pressure. Fighters who once stood on opposite sides now fought shoulder to shoulder. Old grudges were set aside, replaced by shared survival and a single enemy. From windows and rooftops, citizens watched with wide, fearful eyes. Yet beneath the terror stirred something unfamiliar: hope. The prince's return. In alleyways and ruined homes, commoners whispered the same name. Some clutched crude carvings of the royal crest, others pressed hands to their chests as if holding on to belief itself. The lost prince had returned, and with him, the possibility that the future was not yet stolen. In stark contrast, Ren's forces tightened their grip on a central district. Soldiers formed rigid lines, armor polished, commands sharp and unforgiving. Their order was cold, absolute, and utterly divorced from the city they claimed to protect. At a shattered intersection, Grog planted himself like a living bulwark. Behind him, civilians fled as General Darius coordinated troop movements with fierce clarity. Blades rang, arrows flew, and still Grog did not yield. Every step back was denied. As dawn broke, pale light pierced the smoke hanging over the capital. Ruin and fire remained, but so did movement, resistance, and resolve. Against the burning skyline, hope rose fragile and defiant. The city still stood, and so did the chance for something better. Life returned slowly in two distant places. Within the royal infirmary, King Aldrich lay propped against pillows, eyes open once more, color gradually returning to his face as physicians watched closely. At the same time, far beneath the city, Ilara rested in a hidden sanctuary, green gold light pulsing gently around her as her breathing steadied. Both had survived. For the first time since the arrow flew, the realm dared to hope. By daylight, the capital told a different story. Smoke thinned above shattered streets as loyalist forces and former rebels stood together amid the aftermath. Ren's faction had been driven back, their banners torn down, their soldiers disarmed or scattered. The city was wounded, but no longer drowning in chaos. Deep underground, in a chamber lit by harsh torchlight, Ren sat rigid at a long table. The confidence he once wore like armor was gone, replaced by tightly controlled anger. Shadows stretched long across the walls, turning the room into a place of plotting rather than command. Beside him stood Korvok, arms crossed. His crimson eyes burned with frustration. This outcome had not been calculated. The city was not meant to hold. At the far end of the table sat a cloaked merchant figure, face entirely hidden within darkness. Only gloved hands were visible, heavy rings catching faint light. He said nothing. He did not need to. Ren slammed his hand down onto a map of the capital. Markers scattered across stone where his forces had fallen. Lines of control erased in a single night. His voice rose. Not in command but disbelief. The rebel factions were supposed to weaken the kingdom, not unite with it. Korvac answered sharply, gesturing at the map with an accusing sweep of his hand. The sudden allegiance of the rebels with General Darius had changed everything. Someone had misjudged the people. Someone had underestimated the prince. From beneath the hood, the merchant's lips curved into a faint, unreadable smile. Candlelight brushed only the lower edge of his face. Failure, it seemed, did not unsettle him. It merely suggested that new methods would be required. Silence fell over the chamber. Firelight wavered as the conspirators sat with the weight of their miscalculation. The plan had not collapsed, but it had cracked. And through that crack, something dangerous was already pushing back. Within the quiet of the royal infirmary, King Aldrich sat upright against pillows, the crown resting once more upon his brow. His hand reached out, not as a ruler, but as a father. Kaito stood beside him, uncertain and still, until the king's fingers closed around his wrist. No words were needed. Years of loss, guilt, and unanswered questions passed between them in a single breath. The reunion was quiet, but it carried the weight of a kingdom restored. The ceremony followed soon after. In the grand hall, Kaito stood before the throne where the king now sat at the highest seat, supported but resolute. A circle of monks moved with practiced reverence. Fire bowls lifted as sacred flames rose steady and bright. The ritual spoke of lineage, of trial by survival, of a crown reclaimed not by ambition, but by endurance. In the front row sat those who had carried the cost of that endurance. Kale watched with careful eyes, already measuring the future. General Darius stood tall, armor polished, loyalty unhidden. Grog sat like an unmoving stone, presence alone a vow. Beside him, Ilara rested, pale and bandaged, still recovering, yet fully present. Nobles filled the rows behind them, silent now, bearing witness to legitimacy made undeniable. Even as celebration echoed, work had already begun. Scaffolding climbed shattered walls, homes were rebuilt stone by stone, and soldiers labored beside civilians rather than above them. Sunlight broke through thinning smoke, illuminating a capital not healed, but healing. The crown had returned, and with it, the fragile, hard-won chance to begin again. Outside the palace, the city answered. Streets once ruled by fear erupted into celebration. Lanterns rose, banners unfurled, and voices filled the air with relief and joy. The name of the crown prince carried from square to square, not as rumor, but as promise. In the royal throne room, Ren stood before King Aldrich with his head bowed and shoulders lowered. His posture spoke of humility, his voice carefully measured. He reported that justice had already been carried out, swift and decisive, against a certain viscount and baron who, he claimed, had orchestrated the civil unrest. According to them, Ren said, Kaito had been framed as an assassin, dismissed as a false prince. Ren presented himself not as an architect of chaos, but as one who had been deceived. Upon a ceremonial table lay the proof of that justice. 2 execution notices sealed in dark red wax, noble insignias pressed deep into parchment. The names, Viscount and Baron, were written cleanly, officially. Final. The documents closed the matter neatly, too neatly, as if blame itself had been packaged and delivered. Ren knelt then, lowering himself fully to the polished floor. His hands pressed flat, his voice thick with practiced remorse as he begged punishment for his failure to recognize the prince sooner. He spoke of shame, of loyalty, of grief at his own blindness. Around him, the court watched in silence, well aware of how often such performances spared lives and careers. The king remained still upon the throne. The crown sat heavy upon his brow, his expression weary rather than convinced. There was no direct evidence tying Ran to the conspiracy, no document or witness that could withstand scrutiny. And Ran was not merely a minister. He was a high noble, deeply rooted in the court structure. With limited options and a fragile peace to protect, the king allowed the matter to rest. For now. Among the assembled court, Kaito stood silent. One hand clenched tightly at his side beneath his royal coat, knuckles whitening with restrained fury. He did not speak. He did not challenge the decision. But the promise formed within him was firm and unyielding. This was not the end. He would find the truth, and when he did, Ren would have nowhere left to kneel. With the truth laid bare, the pattern became impossible to deny. Humans, demons, and elves had all been maneuvered, pushed into conflict by hands that profited from division. In the royal strategy chamber, Kaito stood beside King Aldrich at a round table marked with the symbols of all three races. Maps and sealed letters lay spread before them. For the first time, war was not being planned, but questioned. Kaito bowed slightly before the king, not as a formality, but as acknowledgement of shared resolve. Attendants moved quietly, preparing formal invitations for a peace summit. No speeches were made. None were needed. Both ruler and heir understood what this moment required, and what it risked. Far from the human capital, the messages were received. In the demon realm, Varen read Kaito's letter in silence, firelight flickering across his eyes as old memories and hard truths stirred together. In the elven forest, Eltharin held the same words with careful hands, his expression softened by recognition, not only of the danger, but of the courage it took to speak across borders. Days later, the three stood together once more, no longer fugitives or survivors, but envoys. Kaito wore the weight of royalty openly now. Ilara, still recovering, stood upright through sheer will. Grog remained solid and unyielding at their side. Documents in hand, they represented not perfection, but intent. Each carried the voice of their people into uncertain ground. On a neutral map, three routes converged toward a single marked location, Temple City. Human, demon, and elven symbols glowed faintly where they met. It was not peace yet, but it was the first step toward choosing dialogue over bloodshed. And this time, all sides had agreed to listen. It was the monks who proposed the venue. The neutral Temple City, ancient, revered, and claimed by no crown, rose from stone and silence at the crossroads of belief and restraint. Wide courtyards opened between weathered temples as robed figures gestured calmly toward the city's heart. Here, they said, no banner held dominion. Here, words would be heard before blades. Elsewhere, preparations took a different shape. Ren stood beneath official standards as columns of heavily armed soldiers marched into the city. Their orders were framed as protection for incoming delegates, their formations neat and disciplined. Yet steel outnumbered ceremony, and watchful eyes noted how easily guardians could become occupiers. Refusing to rely on promises alone, Grog secured his own answer to uncertainty. In a bustling market square, he negotiated with a mercenary company drawn from every race: humans, beastfolk, elves, and demi-humans, demon, each seasoned, alert, and uninterested in politics beyond survival. Coin changed hands, terms were set, and vigilance was bought without illusion. Along the temple walls, Ilara traced the city's wards with careful hands. Most barriers shimmered with ancient strength, runes humming with quiet assurance. But not all. Some sections were faint, fractured in ways that felt intentional rather than decayed. Her expression tightened as understanding settled in. The first day of the summit began in calm ceremony. Monks moved through open courtyards, staff attended to guests, and guards took their positions with practiced neutrality. Among them walked others, faces unremarkable, movements precise. Syndicate agents blended seamlessly into the Temple City's rhythm as supply crates marked for aid were guided deeper into sacred corridors. The architecture preached peace. The intent did not. Behind altar walls and beneath carefully lifted stone flooring, hands worked in silence. Bomb mechanisms were assembled piece by piece, traps set with lethal patience. Nothing rattled. Nothing sparked. Elsewhere, Kaito moved through shadowed passages, hood drawn low. In his hand were coded maps and route markers, information fed to him by the spymaster's network. He followed supply paths, counted footsteps, and traced patterns meant to stay invisible. This was not a patrol. It was a hunt conducted without witnesses. Outside the city, the truth revealed itself. A hidden storehouse lay open beneath torchlight as caravans unloaded their cargo. There was no grain, no medicine, only weapons, armor, and stacks of printed sheets filled with slogans and lies. Aid was the disguise. Logistics were the weapon. On a narrow rooftop passage, Kaito met resistance. A masked figure dropped from above, blades crossing mid-air as steel rang once against stone. The exchange was fast, precise, and brutally efficient. Neither gained ground. Neither yielded. When they separated, the distance between them felt intentional, as if the fight itself had been a message. Moments later, Kaido drove the assassin back against a stone wall, one arm twisted behind them, his dagger pressed close to their throat. The figure did not beg. Instead, they laughed softly and spoke a warning. Peace, they said, would starve thousands. Entire cities and guilds built on the economy of war. If the fighting stopped, so would the flow of coin, and those who lived by it would never allow that. The interrogation did not last long. The syndicate assassin knelt in the dim chamber, wrists bound, posture rigid but unbroken. Around them, documents lay scattered across a stone table. Maps, seals, coded orders. Piece by piece, the picture formed. Routes, payments, commands. Every thread led back to a single name. Kaido pressed a gloved hand against an open ledger, holding the page flat. The code was already broken. Sealed orders bore the unmistakable insignia of Ren. There was no ambiguity left, only confirmation. The conspiracy was no longer hidden. It was documented. The confrontation came in the heart of Ren's operation chamber, the control room meant to coordinate, delegate protection for the summit. Patrol routes covered the walls, signal lines crisscrossing like a web. Ren stood before them, composed and confident. Across the room, Kaito faced him in silence. The air felt tight, as if the room itself understood what was about to be said. Ren laughed. Not quietly, hysterically. He threw his head back, arms spread wide, voice cracking as years of restraint finally broke. He spoke of his father, half-brother to the king, overlooked and discarded, even though was more capable, more suitable, yet denied the throne because a crystal did not recognize him. That rejection, Ren said, shattered his father. And now, Ren was simply reclaiming what should have been theirs, by any means necessary. He seized a lineage document and tore it in half, knuckles white with rage. A family crest split down the center, names crossed out in violent ink. Discrimination, he spat. That is what built this kingdom. I am only correcting it. Kaito did not raise his voice. He answered calmly, each word measured and cold. Ren was not correcting injustice. He was feeding his greed with blood. Thousands had died for a grievance too small to justify a single murder. Ren's past did not excuse what he had become. It condemned him. The decision settled in an instant. Kaito moved. The dagger flashed free as he surged forward, closing the distance with lethal intent. This was not hesitation or impulse. It was judgment. Ren froze, laughter dying on his lips as the truth finally reached him. Lineage had brought Kaito here, but choice was what would end this. Seeing certain death in front, Ren did not scream. He smiled, and bit down. The modified pill shattered between his teeth, dissolving instantly as something violent tore through his body. Veins bulged across his face and neck as a demonic violet aura erupted outward, slamming into the walls and cracking the stone floor beneath him. His posture twisted unnaturally, bones straining as control and reason were ripped away. Whatever restraint Ren had relied on was gone. What remained was rage, raw, unstable, and no longer human. Far away, within the fortress of the demon realm, Varen stepped forward from his throne, cloak shifting as he prepared to depart for the summit. At that same instant, betrayal struck. A knife tore through the air toward his throat, hurled from the side by a demon guard whose eyes burned with unnatural light. The attack was precise. Assassination, not impulse. The blade never reached its target. Grog moved without hesitation, catching the knife bare-handed inches from Varen's neck. Sparks and blood sprayed as steel met flesh. Shock rippled through the chamber. The assassination had failed, but the illusion of loyalty shattered. Laughter cut through the confusion. From among the guards, a figure leapt forward as armor tore away mid-motion. Korvac shed his disguise in a single savage movement, face twisted with feral intent as he launched straight at Grog. His battle aura ignited instantly. This was no ambush. It was a challenge long overdue. They collided like colliding worlds. The impact sent shockwaves through the chamber, stone pillars fracturing as guards were thrown aside. Green and red energies clashed violently, raw strength meeting disciplined force. The fortress trembled under the weight of hatred. Blow after blow followed in brutal rhythm. Fists, blades, and sheer mass collided at close range. Neither yielded ground. Grog fought with controlled power, every movement deliberate. Korvac answered with savage ferocity, abandoning defense entirely. This was not a duel, it was the release of years of resentment made flesh. Korvac snarled and reached for desperation. He crushed a jagged illegal pill between his teeth, one forged by the Merchant Guild's darkest alchemy. His eyes flared crimson as veins ignited across his skin. The power flooding him was unstable, corrosive, and absolute. Reason burned away. His body expanded and warped, armor splitting apart as Korvac transformed fully into a demonic monstrosity. A violent red demonic aura exploded outward, shaking the chamber as uncontrolled power consumed him. The fortress groaned under the strain. The last line had been crossed. From this moment on, there would be no return to shadows, only survival.